Okay, we can start.
Okay. Buongiorno a tutti. I'm particularly happy of today's colloquium because it was originally scheduled exactly 1 year ago. It was then cancelled due to the hard lockdown which involved the entire Europe. I'm then willing to consider this event, I hope realistically and not just optimistically, as another sign that we'll soon leave behind us this terrible year and a half. Having said this, I'm honored to introduce to you Professor Clemens Bechinger. He graduated in physics from Heidelberg University in 1990 and got a PhD in physics from Konstanz University in 1993. He received his habilitation at the same university in 1999 and then went to Stuttgart University as a professor, where he also became head of the physics department. In 2017, so just a few years ago, he came back to the sunny and charming Konstanz, where he is now the leader of a very productive group in soft matter, active matter, colloidal physics, non-equilibrium statistical physics, mainly from the studies from the experimental side. And for these studies, he developed many strong and innovative optical methods. In this area, he was the recipient of a prestigious and rich advanced year C grant in 2016. He also received the Walter Schottky Prize in 2000 and is the Max Planck Research Fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Stuttgart since 2007. In today's colloquium, after a broad introduction to active matter, Professor Bechinger will present new exciting experiments on systems of active particles where, for the first time, the social interactions among the particles can be controlled with laser beams. So, thank you again for your attention and enjoy the show. And Clemens, the microphone is all yours. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gianpaolo, for the very kind invitation, also for the nice introduction. I just tried to share my screen. This should work now. Okay. You mentioned the sunny Konstanz. Well, it's not that sunny right now, but I hope I can put some sun into my talk somehow. And I mean, you already mentioned the title. It's about collective states. We want to understand how collective states, and below you just see a couple of examples. I'm sure you know these are a flock of starlings, this is a school of fish, but also these collective phenomena also occur at a micron scale. So this is actually a bath of bacteria. And the question is, how does it come? How is it able that groups which are comprised of the same type of individuals without a leader, just by following certain behaviors, form such nice complex spatio-temporal patterns? And hold on, I have to, okay, let me see. Now it works, okay. And as a physicist, so the way I prefer to look at is like that. So I consider any individual as a kind of an information processing device. It receives information. So this is shown here as these arrows. You see, sometimes the arrows have two heads, 2 points and only one, which reflects the fact that sometimes information is exchanged in a reciprocal manner, but sometimes there can be also a unidirectional information flow. I will show you later an example. For example, vision. A particle can be seen by one particle while not seen by that particle, which is highly non-reciprocal. And just by processing this information flow and changing your emotional behavior, this is the underlying idea. On that basis, one should be able to understand the formation of collective states. Well, if you now look into living systems, often it is not clear what type of information is exchanged, right? Also, it's often not clear over what range information is exchanged, and it becomes it's also often very little is known about the influence of delays between when you receive some information but you only respond to it in a delayed fashion. It's not clear how this would affect collective states. Now, at the University of Konstanz, there's a huge cluster on collective behavior, and these people, they are mostly comprised of biologists. They really look at living systems. They go into the field. They observe, for example, here a school of fish. They measure the trajectories, the velocities, the alignment, and then they simply try. They produce a huge data set, and then they try to extract some correlations. They find some correlations in the velocities, in the alignment, in next neighbor distances, and based on these correlations, they try now to infer an underlying interaction rule, right? So the idea is this is a typical top-bottom approach where you try to extract the underlying interaction rule by observing a macroscopic state. Well, as a physicist, we don't love to work with living animals. We prefer to go to synthetic systems, and what I will show you later is that we can make tiny colloidal particles behave very similar like a fish. For example, they can also swim, but in contrast to a fish where we do not know how it would respond to its peers, in our case, we can impose very well-defined interaction rules. I will show you a couple of examples for that later. And then we just have such particles. Each particle is following that rule, and all we have to do now, and this is then a typical bottom-up approach, is that we observe then the outcome of the rule. You see, this is exactly the inverse approach as I showed you before. And the advantage is that you can vary the rules because we can impose them very precisely, almost like in a numerical simulation, but it's an experiment, as you will see later. We can vary them in a very defined fashion and can therefore study how much a change in rule affects then the collective behavior. So that's the general concept we are following. Now, the first thing I want to show you is how we make our particles move, okay? And that's relatively simple. It's based on colloidal particles. This is a typical size, 3 to 4 microns. The size is not that important, actually, but what is important is that they are covered on one half of the side by a light-absorbing material. In our case, it's a thin layer of a carbon, which is deeply black, 20 nanometers. So it's a transparent particle, but on one side, it's highly absorptive. Now, the trick is the use of the solvent. So these particles are suspended in a fluid, and it's not just an ordinary fluid, it's a binary mixture. It's water lutein, but that's not relevant here. It's a binary mixture which has a lower demixing point, and all you have to know for this talk is the following. If you keep this mixture below 35 degrees, it's in a mixed state. If it's above, there is a demixing point, then it demixes into a water-rich and a lutein-rich phase. Now, all the experiments we are doing are essentially here a couple of degrees below the demixing point, so the solvent is, in the first place, completely homogeneous. Now, what happens if you put such particle to such a mixture and focus a laser spot onto it? I mean, the laser light, it's green light. It will, of course, absorb, the light will be partially absorbed here, not fully, only a tiny fraction, but it will be absorbed here, which means that the cap part heats up. And if you do it right, the temperature of the cap part exceeds here this critical temperature. So this part here goes into the regime where the fluid mixture starts to demix, while the transparent side is still, so to say, facing to the mixed side. And this is what you see here. This is actually the true demixing, which has been imaged here by one of my former postdocs, Ruben Gomez-Solano. And because now this demixing is unfavorable, the system wants to remix, the system will develop a fluid flow close to the surface, right? And this then leads to a particle propulsion in the other direction. Why is that? Very simple. If you are in a rowing boat, if you pull the paddle to the front, you will move the fluid from the back to the front, but the boat is moving in the opposite direction. That's exactly the same principle. It's a force-free, swimming is a force-free, so to say, issue here, right? You move the fluid in one side and you move in the other direction. That's exactly what happens in our particle. The nice thing is now that we can control it with light because, I should first show you here. This is just one of those particles. You see the cap. This is a two-dimensional, it's a thin sample plane. All the experiments I'm showing you today are in a thin sample plane. Particle motion is two-dimensional. Also, the particle rotation is two-dimensional. That's a little bit more tricky. If you have questions on that, I'm happy to answer that at the beginning, but consider the problem as truly two-dimensional. And the trick is now that we can change the velocity of the particle u as a function of the laser intensity. The more the intenser the laser is, the more we demix, the more that the cap heats above the critical point, the faster the particle is. You see, we can very nicely control that. And if you study that motion in more detail, it leads to a so-called persistent random walk, which is very similar like that in, for example, bacteria. I mentioned we want to replicate, so to say, other motile systems. And the mean square displacement then typically looks like that. You have a short time ballistic t-square behavior, which is then because of the randomization of the direction due to rotational diffusion leads to an effective diffusion. So that's something which is very well known. It has been also observed in many systems. Now, before I show you how we actually control the social interactions of these particles, let me just show you two experiments where you see that even without a control, these particles are already, well, I wouldn't say they are smart, but they show some behaviors which are also well known in biological systems. And one is, and this is what you see on the left side, is Gravitaxis. And many bacteria actually, or actually all bacteria are more heavy than water, but they have developed the ability to swim opposite to gravity. And this is called Gravitaxis. And the question is how they do that. They cannot regulate their buoyancy as a fish. So if you think about it, it's not such a trivial question how to distinguish between up and down if you are super tiny. And actually they do that by their shape asymmetry. What you see here, this is a similar type of an active particle, which is asymmetric, right? And because of its asymmetry, it's in a plane, it's following a circle, what you see here, right? Now, if you tilt now the sample and turn the propulsion off, of course, such a particle would sediment down. That's a clear thing, right? Gravity is pushing it down. And the question is, if you add now both effects, the propulsion and the sedimentation, if you now turn on in the sedimentation process the propulsion, the question is what will happen? And surprisingly, it's not just a superposition of a circular motion and a sedimenting motion. It's a straight, more or less straight up motion, which resembles this Gravitaxis. I'm not going to tell you how that works. We understand it. We can write down even equations of motion. All I want to show you that even in the absence of control, these particles are already displaying some living-like behavior. So the other example is shown here on the right side, which is phototaxis. I think many of you know that, for example, cyanobacteria, if you apply a light gradient, they always move towards a light gradient. And this is also true for our particles. They can move into the dark, they can move into the bright. This can be tuned, and they also can follow here optical pulses, okay? All right, so this is just as a comment, this is a last example here, just also to show you uncontrolled particles. All the particles are simply active, and what you see is if you look at them at small concentrations, they form these short-lived clusters, they move together, form clusters, they dissolve. But if you go to higher packing fractions, the clusters no longer dissolve, and eventually you are left with clusters which are surrounded by a gas phase, which then leads to such a phase diagram with a critical point. This is the Peclet number. This is essentially the particle velocity. This is the volume fraction, and this transition here makes you go from a homogeneous phase into an inhomogeneous phase, which is then the dense clusters and then the surrounding gas. So these are all effects which do not invoke any particle control, no special social interactions, but this is exactly what I want to tell you now. And I will give you two examples here, and the first one is based on visual perception. Before I show you how we do it experimentally, let me first show you, because the concept is easy to understand. Just think about a computer simulation, okay? Let's assume you have here active particles, and we assume that each particle has a finite vision cone, and this vision cone is characterized by an angle of 2 alpha, okay? And in order to, so to say, to quantify the perception of these particles, we simply say we count, let's say, consider this particle here, we count all the other particles which are inside this vision cone of 2 alpha, and this is what you see here. We sum up of the neighbors, and in order to weight the, or to account the fact that a particle which is closer to you contributes more to your visual perception than a particle which is far away, we weight the particle distances by 1 over r, and then we sum up here all the particles which are seen by that one inside this vision cone here, right? And this is our visual perception. This is a value where every particle, I can tell for every particle how much it is seeing from its neighbors. And you see immediately, if alpha is smaller than pi, this is highly non-reciprocal, because this particle here is this one, but this particle is not seen by this one, okay? Now, this is the perception. I told you we consider this particle as information processing devices. This is the information each particle perceives from its environment. But now, to make collective state, you somehow have to respond to it. You have to adjust your emotional behavior. And this is here the decision process. What happens is now the following. Here, this is again this perception parameter, and there's a threshold. And every particle is calculating so its perception, and if the perception is below a sharp defined threshold value p star, the particle is just passive, right? I told you by the amount of laser light, I will show you that later, we can control the velocity, and if the perception is below a threshold, it remains passive, it's just doing Brownian motion, and above we make it active, okay? So this is the simple rule here, right? We do, and that's very important, we do not change the alignment of particle. We just turn on and stop, so to say, the propulsion engine based on this perception parameter. And this has now consequences, and this is exactly what I want to show you here. Consider that we start with a group of particles, and now I want to show you how the perception here, this perception value here, changes if we move a particle from the center towards the edge of that group. So here small r is the center towards the group, r naught is the radius of the group, and we do it once for a particle which is always pointing outside, which is the red curve, and it's clearly its perception will be largest in the center and then gradually go down and then vanish if it's outside the group, of course, right? However, if you have a particle pointing towards the group center, you see you have such a non-monotonic behavior. If the particle is at the edge of the group, it sees most of the particles, right? And that's the reason why it first goes up, and then in the center, where it only looks through half of the group, the perception goes down, right? And you see already, and that's a result of this non-reciprocal interaction, or non-reciprocal rule here. This means that we have a a non-monotonic perception rule. This is very different than most interaction potentials in physical systems, right? Okay, now when you impose that in an experiment, I haven't shown you yet how the experiments work. I will do that in a second, but this is the result of the rule, right? These are these colloidal particles. Each colloidal particle is exactly following the same rule what I just described. And what you see is we have a cohesive group, and it will cohesive forever, right? It's not surrounded by a dilute gas phase, as I showed you before. That's a completely different state here. And this was quite surprising, not only to us, but also to many others, that based on such a simple rule, you can already make such a cohesive swarm. We call it a swarm because there is no particular other order present. Okay, now how we do that actually is relatively simple. It's based on an optical feedback loop. So we have a fast particle imaging system. We can online track the position of the particles. We can also track the orientation of the particles. And because we can track the orientation of the particles, we can now do what I showed you before. We can now give every particle, depending on its position and orientation, a vision cone. Then we can calculate its perception, and then we can determine for every particle if its perception is below or above this threshold. Don't forget, we are doing an experiment. Now what we have to do is, if a particle is above the threshold, we have to make it active, and this is then done by shining a laser focus on it, okay? And this is simply done by a so-called acousto-optical deflector, where we can very rapidly steer a laser beam, and the idea is now we permanently track the positions, right, and give the information about the position and whether a particle should be illuminated or not, so whether a particle should be active or passive, then we selectively illuminate it. And this is so fast that this can be considered as a quasi-instantaneous process, okay? And this is exactly, I'll show you once more, this is exactly how such a video has been done. You have to consider that all the time the laser beam is scanning across the particle and making choices on the fly, active, not active, active, not active, and this is changing dynamically during this process. Now, I try to avoid as many equations as possible here because I understand that you are coming essentially from different fields of physics, but let me give you a very simple way to understand that, and this is shown here. If you, to understand why we have here this cohesion, even though there are no attractive forces. Normally you would say, well, to make something cohesive, I need some attraction. There is no attraction here. So why it's cohesive? If a particle is at the edge of the group, we said, okay, its perception is larger than the threshold. The threshold's value here is set to the center, so it's active, so it certainly would move towards the group center. If a particle is pointing away from the group, this would and it's at the edge of the group, so this would correspond to this position here. Its perception is below the threshold, it's not active, so it will diffuse even a little bit further away here, but at some point it will turn around because its motion is also subjected to rotational diffusion. So at some point it will turn around, and even if the particle has diffused a little bit away here, right, if it changes its orientation, if it points away, then it changes from the red to the blue curve. It becomes active and then also joins the group. So it's as simple as this. And this is also consistent with if you measure the distribution, where we have the active particles, where we have the passive particles. According to that rule, you would expect that the inside of the group is essentially comprised of active particle, the outside of passive. This fits perfectly to that rule. Now, the real advantage of our approach is that we can vary parameters. We can vary, for example, the vision cone. You cannot easily do that in a living system, right? Here we can do that, and what you see is these are heat maps. These are particle probability distributions when we gradually increase here the vision cone. And what you see is that for a particular threshold, cohesion is only maintained up, in that case, pi over 2, if the vision cone becomes too large, cohesion is lost. What you also see, if the vision cone is very small, then the shape of the group is more expanded, and that's also supported by numerical simulations. I give you already a caveat at that point here. Simulations sometimes work. For that situations, it works. I will also later show an example where simulations do not work, right? Because you might say, well, why not doing everything into a computer? Additional interactions, hydrodynamic interactions, which are very important and which are not considered by typical computer simulations. Now you can, here, this is kind of a state diagram. Here is the vision cone angle. Here's the perception threshold. And just 1 second, please. Okay, thank you for waiting. So here is a state diagram. Here, vision cone angle. Here's the perception threshold. And in blue, these are the range where you find a cohesion. And you see if the vision cone is too large or if the perception is too large, cohesion is lost. And there are also good reasons for understanding that. I will not go into detail here, but this is well understood now. So the second example is related to a swirl. Swirls, or vortices, as a physicist would call it, are very often found in nature. This is just one example. And of course, to make a swirl, you definitely also have to adjust the alignment, right? I mean, you cannot make a swirl just by changing the velocity, but you also have to adjust your velocity direction. And that is the question, how we can do that in our experiments. Here I show you once more the situation of such a capped particles. They are called after the Roman god Janus particles, right? They have two faces here. And if you illuminate the particle in a homogeneous fashion, then this demixing zone I showed you before is actually symmetric around the cap, which means that also the flow, the fluid flow, which is essentially leading to self-propulsion, is actually symmetric, right? So again, the particle moves opposite to the surface flow, to the fluid flow here. If you now illuminate the particle in an inhomogeneous fashion, it's clear this part becomes hotter than here. You have more demixing than here, so the demixing zone becomes asymmetric. The fluid flow becomes also no longer axisymmetric. Here it's larger than here, and this leads to a torque. It's a little bit like if you're in a boat, and on one side you have people who have a stronger left arm than a right arm, then you will see that the boat will turn, and this is exactly what happens. We get a torque, and it moves until a certain situation is reestablished. And this is exactly what we do now. We can not only before we were always focusing the laser spot exactly in the center of the carbon cap. Now, by deliberately offsetting it in a specific direction, we can make the particle move in one direction here, right? And of course, because we know the position, the orientation of the particles every instant of time, we can also give particles certain, so to say, we say turn left, turn right, right? We cannot only say move fast, move slow, but we can also say try to turn left, try to turn to the right, okay? And this is now what helps us to make swirls. And for swirls, and swirls have been investigated a lot, you need, again, a kind of a interaction rule, right? You have to say how I have to adjust my alignment in order to form a swirl. And for that, we use a so-called zonal model here, which is also often applied from biologists. So the idea is the following. So this is your group of particles. Pick any particle. So any particle follows exactly the same rule. This particle here, it has an orientation U. The first thing it wants to do, it wants to swim roughly towards the center of mass, which is, let's say, somewhere here. Here you have the same situation. This is our reference particle. This is the center of mass, and it says, okay, I want to roughly swim towards the center of mass because I want to stay cohesive. And this is something which is found in many, many animal systems. They want to stay cohesive. However, you are not swimming directly towards P, the center of mass, but with a defined deviation angle to the left or to the right. So you can either swim in that direction or in that direction, right? And the choice whether you swim to the left or to the right relative to the center of mass, that is made dependent on the orientation of your next neighbors. You evaluate the mean orientation of next neighbors, and then you just decide for that direction the minus or the plus, which is closer to the alignment of your neighbors. So in that situation, you would decide for that direction and not for that direction, because the mean orientation of your next neighbors is this violet arrow here. So the idea is, if you think about it, is so to say a compromise. Avoid collisions or reduce the number of collisions with your next neighbors. Try to move more or less in concert with them, but still try to roughly go towards the center of mass. And if you do that, this is the outcome, okay? So again, every particle is following that rule. I have you the same picture from the perspective of a single particle, right? And this now leads to a very robust swirl here. And of course, you want to characterize such a swirl. And for that, we introduce a rotational order parameter, which is a little bit like the angular momentum. Ri is the position of a particle from the particle I from the center of mass. Ui is its orientation, and Ez is just a unit vector in z direction to get a scalar out of it, right? And by applying this order parameter to such a state, and this is the green curve, you see OR, it has a value of might be 0.7 or so. It's a decent swirl, and here and then it can also change its swirling here. It's counterclockwise, and if OR is negative, it's a clockwise swirling here. What's important to remember is this deviation angle of delta. The green curve has been obtained for a deviation angle which is 67.5 degrees. And the gray curve is if the deviation angle is 0, then there is no swirling at all. And that's not too surprising, because if the particles are only allowed to swim towards the center of mass, there is no tangential velocity, which means then we will see this then leads to a disordered, still cohesive state, a swarming state, similar to what I've shown you before. Now, these swirling direction, this vortex direction, they can also spontaneously flip. I showed you already one example. And what you see here, this is just a locally resolved rotational order parameter. Red means counterclockwise, blue means clockwise. And you see during such a transition here, there's a lot of fluctuations. I will come back to that fluctuations later, which then make this transition from this direction into that direction. But you also see when the rotational order parameter is small or 0, the polarization, so the alignment of particles, is always very high. And it turns out if you plot these two values against each other, you obtain here OP versus OR. You obtain here the swirling states, which are characterized by high rotation, either +1, -1, and small polarization. And this here is a so-called flocking state, which has no rotation, but which has a very high polarization. This would then make the group move in one direction. But this flocking state only, the states with this high polarization, only occurs only a very small instant of time. That's the reason why the swirl is not really moving apart. But interestingly, changing the rotation always leads over a temporal flocking state. That's also something which has been observed in fish. Now, maybe I look a little bit at the clock and I jump over that. The first thing we wanted to know is how stable is such a swirl, because of course, if you're an animal and you form a swirl, it might be in order to protect from predators, it should be also relatively stable, right? You don't want to fly apart even though there is only a very small perturbation. And for that, we have done the following experiment. We have added here, we have selected 5 particles in the middle, and we told these particles, you are only allowed to circulate in clockwise direction. All the other particles are able to choose freely, as according to the rule I showed you before, to go to the left or to the right of the center of mass. And we embed these particles in a swirl, which was originally swirling as a whole in counterclockwise direction. And now you can observe how these 5 particles can turn the rotation of the entire swirl as a function of time here from counterclockwise to clockwise. This is also once more shown here. This is the average rotational order parameter as a function of time, and the different numbers here, the different curves, correspond now to the number of particles which insist of always going in the other direction. And what you see is that if you have 10%, this is a swirl made of 50 particles. If you have 10% or more particles, they are already enough to completely determine the entire swirl behavior. Okay, so this means if you have a couple of uninformed or misinformed or misbehaving particles, right, they are able to turn the entire flock and impose a certain rotational direction. Another thing also related to stability is the following. We were adding here a obstacle into the swirl. I mean, this can be also done by adding a kind of a repulsion. There is no physical obstacle here. It's a kind of a hypothetical obstacle. So it's just a region. Once a particle is moving there, it's kind of reflected. We apply a reflection rule in addition to the social interaction rule. And of course, if you look here at the probability distribution, you obtain a kind of a donut-shaped thing if you increase the obstacle. However, and that is, I think, the more surprising thing, and this is what you see here. When we move now the obstacle, right, we apply always the same rule to the particles. You see the entire swirl is following the trajectory of the obstacle. So we can control an entire swirl made of up to a couple of hundred particles simply by adding such an obstacle and moving it along a predefined trajectory. Now, I showed you that this deviation angle here is a very important parameter, right? I showed you if the deviation angle is small, again, the deviation angle is, so to say, how much the particles deviate in their swimming relatively to the center of mass. If the deviation angle is small, then they swim more or less towards the center of mass, and we have a kind of a swarm, right? You see particles are randomly going through each other, and if delta is large, we have a swirl, okay? And accordingly, what you see here, this is now the probability of the absolute value of the rotational order parameter as a function of the rotational order parameter as a function of delta. And if delta is small, then of course, most of the time we have a rotational order parameter which is very small, indicating there is only little rotational order in the system. If we increase delta, for example here up to the green point, then you see a peak develops here at larger OR, indicating that indeed we have a rotational state, okay? However, what you see is there seems to be no coexistence between a swarm and a swirl. So either the maximum is at small values or it's at large values. There is no single curve. I could show you more curves where we have 2 peaks at the same time. No coexistence between a swarm and a swirl. And I mean, as a physicist, the first thing this reminded us is, could this be a critical transition? And in order to explain you a little bit more what I mean by that, let's once more look here at the rotational order parameter. It's defined like that. You see, it's contains here also the orientation of the particle velocity. The first thing you realize if upon time inversion, right? You see here swirl moving forward in time, one moving backward in time. We have the rotational order parameter has an odd time reversal symmetry, because if you reverse the time, the velocities reverse and the rotational order parameter is reversed as well. Because the rotational order parameter is not conserved, there is no continuity equation, and you can show that the simplest equation describing the dynamics is then just an expansion of the rotational order parameter in order of odd powers of it, okay? And eta t, this is just some thermal noise, okay? You can show this is the simplest way to, so to say, to obey this odd time reversal symmetry under the constraint that OR is not conserved. Now, I showed you before, we can measure the rotational order parameter as a function of time, right? I just show you once more such a curve just to here, rotational order parameter as a function of time. And from curves like that, of course, we can also calculate then the derivative, the time derivative of the rotational order parameter, which is here plotted as a function of the rotational order parameter. And what you see here, again, for small delta, the data points here, these bullets, they are essentially scattered around zero. Remember, small delta means small rotational order parameters. And if delta is larger, then the rotational order parameters are at larger values. And what we do now, we fit these data points exactly with that equation here. And if you do that, the only fitting parameters are A and B. And what you see here, A starts from being positive and then becomes negative, right? While B is always positive and essentially constant. And this immediately leads to a bifurcation. And why is that? Very simple. If you calculate the steady state solution of this equation here, it's just given by, it's a quadratic equation, it's just given by plus minus the real part of the square root minus A over B. When A is positive, right, because of the minus sign, the real part, you have an imaginary root, so the real part is zero, right? So you see here this mean value of the rotation parameter as a function of delta is first zero, and once A changes from positive to negative, then minus A becomes positive, and here you have the plus minus sign, then the solution splits off. And this again means that at small delta, fully consistent to what I showed you before, we have a swarm, and if you reach a critical value of delta, which is exactly that point here where A crosses from positive to negative, then the solution splits off, okay? Now, what you also see here is B is constant, we said. So A, you immediately see A has the dimension of an inverse time. So that means if A becomes very small, essentially zero, it would mean that this time scale related to that should diverge. And this is exactly also a typical feature of a critical transition, critical scaling down. And this is what you see here. We have plotted the autocorrelation of the rotational order parameter as a function of time, again for different values of delta. And the closer you get here to that point, which is around 30 degrees here, you see the curves decay slower and slower, and we could actually fit that with a superposition of two exponential decays, while one exponential time is is rather constant, and the other one here strongly increases here by more than one order of magnitude approaching the critical point. So this is a typical hallmark of a critical behavior. We have this bifurcation, we have this critical slowing down. And as the last evidence, so to say, to close that picture, I mean, here you have the dynamics. I showed you we can describe the dynamics of the rotational order parameter by this expansion here, but you can also describe the dynamics here by a kind of a Langevin equation, where on the right side there is just an effective potential. It's just, the idea is we consider the dynamics of the rotational order parameter, and the question is, how does the potential look like? And by comparing these equations, you immediately see here it's a superposition of a squared and a quartic term here. Because we know A and B, we can immediately calculate these values for different deltas. And this is something you know very well from a Landau picture, right? And again, here we have the two swirls. Here is the swarm. And what we can also do is we can experimentally, so to say, compare to that calculated curves, because we can simply measure from the measured probability distribution of the rotational order parameter. These are the curves I showed you before. Applying a Boltzmann factor, from that we can obtain here an effective potential. And if we do that, this is exactly what we obtain. So I would say it's a relatively consistent picture, and we have a quite good evidence that these swirl, the transition from a swirl to a swarm, is actually a critical transition. So the question is, why I'm making such a big point out of that? Well, there's a reason for that, because you know that the susceptibility of a system becomes largest if you are at a critical point, okay? And this has, of course, interesting implications, because if you think about a collective state, at the one side, on one side, you want to be stable, right? Of course, you don't want to immediately fly apart. On the other hand, you also want to be responsive to external threats, for example, okay? And these two conditions, being stable at the one side, but also being able for large fluctuations, for a large susceptibility, this is perfectly fulfilled by a critical point. And what you see here, this is the calculated susceptibility we have obtained from our data. And that this idea of a critical point related to collective states is not complete nonsense is also seen by, there's a lot of literature. For example, there's a group in Rome studying stallings, and they observed the scale-free behavior in stalling flux. So the correlation of the velocity does not scale with the size of the flock, which they took as evidence for a critical behavior. But there are also other, so to say, other examples which point towards an issue of relation between criticality and collectivity. And while in natural systems, you cannot simply tune parameters, you cannot change behaviors. You cannot tell the birds now, please behave a little bit different than before. We can do that in our experiments. And I think that is, again, I hope this makes a little bit more clear the use of having a well-defined interaction rules. Now, at the very end, just one slide, let me once more compare a little bit our experiments versus simulations. I consider our experiments as a kind of a hybrid. It takes the best of both worlds, right? I mean, similar to simulations, we can impose very well-defined interaction rules. We design an interaction rule at a computer when we feed it into the experiments. However, we take advantage of the experiments. We don't have to solve any equations of motion, right? We are not calculating a trajectory. We only say, move forward, try to move to the left, try to move to the right. If there are additional interactions, for example, hydrodynamic interactions, which are present in that systems, they are automatically considered, right? Because our particles see them, they are moving in a real world, and so they don't have to put into the equation of motions. And how important in particular hydrodynamic interactions is, this is seen here. What you see here, this is exactly the same situation. That's actually some particles escaping from a predator. The predator is essentially here, and this group of particles is moving away from the predator. And the same is also true here. The parameters are exactly the same. In the simulations, this is just a simple Langevin simulation here, neglecting hydrodynamic interactions, which are actually very difficult to calculate here, because hydrodynamics and interactions in general is an n-body and many-body interaction problem, and the flow fields are very difficult to calculate, and you see clear differences. And I think that's why I think it's good to do such experiments, because we can exploit. We don't have to do any so to say simplifications. We can include all the interactions present in the system. Okay, I have been asked not to talk too long. So it's 10 to 4 now. So essentially all I wanted to tell you now is actually who did the work. And here you see a number of people, François Lavergne, Celia Lozano, Ruben Gomez-Solano. They have been previous postdocs working on that system. Then Tobias Bäuerle, he just graduated last year. He was actually the first PhD student who came to me and just helped me to realize this idea. We wouldn't know whether this is working, and we had to solve a lot of technical issues. So Tobias, thanks a lot to Tobias. He solved a lot of technical issues. Also Hugo, he was also part of the PhD team. And these people here, Robert, Junjen, and Veit, are still continuing that work. We also got some support from very, very helpful corporations from theoreticians. Particularly, I would like to mention Christian Rover and Meran Kada. I'm sure many of you know Meran from the MIT. They also helped us to understand a little bit these critical issues here. And we also have an ongoing cooperation with Hartmut Löwen, and also since about 2 years we work together with Emanuele Panizan. And the reason we work with Emanuele is shown here, and this is then my last slide. So far I have shown you that we impose an interaction rule, right? And then we hope to replicate a collective state, right? Not every rule we impose is leading to a collective state. In fact, actually, it's more the opposite. You have to carefully think about what rule you have to choose so that the particles spontaneously form a collective state. But there is another way in looking at the problem. You can also say why you don't let the particles dynamically vary their rules, and you do not define the rule, but you define the outcome, okay? And what you see here, this is an experiment which has been done actually during Corona time. This is something where access to lab was super limited. Fortunately, our experiments can be also controlled remotely, but still you have to go here and then. This is an experiment from Veit. And here the purpose was, particles please rotate the rod. The rule how they do that, he didn't impose. He just gave rewards for actions which led to a rotation, and by the use of neural networks, by reinforcement learning, the particles, after a couple of training episodes, came out with that solution. And what we want to do now is to figure out what's the reason actually particles form a swirl, right? Might be what's the best predator avoidance strategy, and we will apply now reinforcement learning to get a little bit more insight on that. Okay, so I hope I was not too long, and I'm happy to receive some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring colloquium. So let's see whether now there are some questions or comments. In the meantime, as you mentioned at the beginning, I was going to ask you about this two-dimensional motion you were referring to. For the particles, you have a 3D, so I guess you are confined in a very thin layer. And so if you can comment about this rotation.
Right. Yes, that's a that's a good point. I mean, the question is why. I mean, that if you have a thin particle sample cell, then the particles can only move in 2D. That's clear. But the question is why also the rotation is then confined to 2D.
Yeah.
Well, that's a little bit more tricky. That's actually part of the answer is hydrodynamic interactions. So the particle is causing a flow field, and because of the no slip boundary condition of the substrate, this leads then to a confinement. That's only part of the truth. The other part of the truth is I showed you that we have a demixing region. Okay, so we have this leads to so-called phoretic interactions, which then also makes the cap to be positioned relative, the cap orientation positioned relative to the underlying surface in such a way that as a total effect, you obtain also the rotation to be only in 2D. That's actually something which is not only specific for our propulsion mechanism, but this has been also observed for example, catalytically moving particles.
Oh, okay. So it's a combination, it's a very tricky combination of fluids and so on. So it's not so
Absolutely. It's not so trivial. No,
so it's
not
very,
at all. Not at all.
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Fortunately, it is like that, because otherwise, to monitor, we can also read out the three-dimensional motion, but of course, it simplifies things a lot if everything is only in 2D. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I just now read the question made by an attendee. Do you know if you're able to give a meaningful interpretation to the dynamical rules that emerge from the reinforcement learning? Are the rules interpretable? Is the solution unique?
Okay, that's a that's a very good question. That's actually a question we are, of course, also asking ourselves. The last question, let me start with that, whether the solutions are unique. I would say that strongly depends on the problem. For example, when it comes here to this rod, I mean, this is a relatively simple task. One thing which is clear, and this is actually essentially what you see here, that particles... Okay, thank you. One way to rotate the rod is that some of the particles accumulate here and some accumulate here, and then this leads to say that they maximize the lever arm. Another rotation, however, is that particles slide here in a swirl-like motion along the rod and transfer momentum via friction. And what solution is observed then very much depends on the friction. And I could imagine there are also situations where you might observe both. But I mean, I think the other part of the question is whether we can sort of say give a meaning to the rules learned from reinforcement learning, or to have some idea whether this is applicable to biological systems. Of course, this is purely speculative. Of course, on the other hand, I would say, because collective behavior is so frequently observed in living systems, I firmly believe that there must be relatively generic underlying rules. There are certainly many system-specific issues, but that's not what we are particularly interested in. We are more interested in generic, of course, coarse-grained rules, and we hope that we are able to find some. Yeah. I hope this answered the question.
Other questions or comments? You may also ask directly. You raise your hand and you may ask your question directly if you want to. At the moment, let's wait. And So I'm just going to ask you another question. So, how important is the shape and the size of the particles you are studying? You said they are just spherical, and this is the diameter. If changing this, the size or the shape, does it make any difference, or it's not so relevant to the overall experiments?
Right.
Can you tune these interactions also by more or less slight changing this the morphology, the shape of these particles?
Yes. Okay. I mean, the size of the particle, that's not very relevant. Of course, the propulsion velocities depends because the cap size varies. That's not also the viscous friction varies. But of course, and I have shown you this example with this L-shaped particles, which is moving in a circle. Of course, this has a huge impact. Right? Shape matters a lot, of course, while size is not super relevant. Actually, we also in different videos you have seen, we have also used different particle sizes. That's not an important parameter.
Okay, another questions.
There is a
Michele, you can also ask the question yourself.
No, there is another answer.
Okay, so the question is, can you rotate the particle by? You can rotate the particle by illuminating the particle asymmetrically. How this is done in practice?
Okay, might be I was too fast. Let me just show you once more this slide here. This is exactly the way it is. So I think what's clear is if you do not heat the cap, or if you do not illuminate the cap in a homogeneous fashion, then maybe I should go once more back. Right? Okay, again, this is a situation where the cap is homogeneously illuminated and the particle moves in that direction, and the demixing region here of this binary mixture is symmetric around this axis here, right? If you now illuminate the particle with a light gradient, this is what I tried to indicate here, then this previously, before the actually symmetric demixing zone is no longer symmetric, right? You demix more here than here because you quench on that side deeper beyond the binodal of this lower demixing region than here. And as a result, the demixing currents, which are these arrows, are larger here than here, right? And then remember my example with a rowing boat where people have, let's say, a tennis arm on one side, which is much stronger than the other. Of course, you would always go in a circle, right? And this is exactly what happens. And technically, this is then achieved by creating local light gradients simply by pushing the laser. If you push the laser center opposite to the direction you want the particle to go, let's say if this is the center of mass and you say you want to go to the right, if you then push the laser spot away from the center of mass in the opposite direction, this then leads exactly to torque so that the particle is, what you see here are in green, particle trajectories, which are actually going from the left to the right. And of course, this information is also updated all the time. So depending on where a particle is and how its orientation is, we just position the laser spot in such a way that we create the corresponding torques. Okay, that's in a nutshell how we do that.
Emanuele raised his hand. So if Emanuele wants to ask the question, or was it just a mistake? You raised your hand?
No, sorry, it was not a mistake. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I had just a curiosity. So have you tried to use also binary mixtures of particles of different size? And the reason I ask is because to make a swirl with this binary mixture. And the reason I ask is because you know, as you mentioned, some animals make swirls to protect their young, and the young are usually a different size. So I wonder whether it would be interesting to assess whether, you know, such demixing happens also from emerges from a rule like you impose.
Okay, so the particle size is, although you're obviously right, the youngers are typically smaller than the parents, okay, the kids are, but what we would not vary the particle size, but the particle behaviors, right? There might be, that's the more important thing. And we haven't done it for the swirls, but what we have done, that's now not included in the talk, and that's something which is currently under submission. We have considered the situation of an escaping group. So as I showed you, if you remember, let me just jump to the very last slide. This is where I showed you this was the situation of an escaping group. Here is the predator, right? And what we did is we said 50% of the particles inside the group are able to respond to the predator by turning away from the predator, but 50% of the particles are not attentive to the predator, right? Reflecting the fact that we have a couple of whatever very selfish particles or ignorant particles. Might be they are sick, might be whatever reasons you can, or they are simply distracted by food or by their, I don't know, by their mating partners, okay? And we measured as a function of the fraction of attentive and inattentive particles. And that's exactly what we can implement here, right? So that not every individual is following the same rule, the escape efficiency. And believe it or not, what we figured out is up to 50% of particles in a group can be inattentive to the predator. They just have to be attentive to their peers, and the overall performance of the group, the overall escape performance, is still identical. And we take this as evidence of a true collective benefit, because there must be a reason why animals group in a large group, because I mean, it's not so clear why that happens, because as a group, you are certainly more easily spotted from a predator compared to an isolated particle. So this disadvantage, right, of being spotted more easily has to be overcompensated. And perhaps, again, I'm very careful. I just can't tell you what our particles do, right? But perhaps the benefit is indeed that the vigilance of the group remains almost constant, even if only a part of the particles are attentive. And might be one thing, that's something I have completely forgotten also to put that in the right context. One of the reasons we are doing our work is not only because we are interested in collective behavior of living systems, we're also very much interested in micro-robotic systems, so autonomously moving microscopic robots. And also there, you want to impose simple rules, robust rules, and figuring out that there's an enhanced vigilance of a collective group is also very helpful if you design, let's say, 1 million micro-robots, okay? Might be there are failures, they have a certain failure rate, and it's very good to see that the overall performance is not necessarily dramatically degrading if you have a few kind of outliers or badly performing particles. That's the reason why I think there are some, it has not only a biological context, but also a technical, a robotic context in which I would like also to put our work.
Thank you.
Matteo, you raised your hand.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, at least yes.
Okay, excellent talk, Clemens. I would like to come to the Mexican hat energy landscape that you partially measured. I have a question. Do you have any evidence of a mismatch of a depth of the potential from the two sides, or do you have data on the other side? Do you have idea of how to induce a transition from one side to the other, because
very good question. Thank you very much. The reason I only show here data points here, actually what we have measured, because of, see, here we have plotted the absolute value of the rotational order parameter, and that's simply because of statistical reasons, right? The systems do not super rapidly evolve in time, so what we have done is we have only evaluated the absolute value, so independent on whether OR was positive or negative, we always mapped it to the same value. So what you see here is actually a combination of values lying on that side and on that side. And you have to believe me that the overall agreement would be still okay, but in order to squeeze out the maximum statistics, we have mapped it on one side. So that was one part of your question. The other question you had was, can we, so to say, induce transitions here? Yes, this is also something we actually have done. Of course, if you look at that, it reminds you very much to a ferromagnet transition, right? And the question is what corresponds to an external field, right? And this is something we can induce. We can vary this deviation angle, and we can. I can even show you. Hold on here. This is how we can change the potential landscape by having the equivalent of an external magnetic field. And what we can do even more, and that's something I'm sure you have seen, that we can also do hysteresis, right? So there is a full replica, so we can map that fully on such a Landau model system with and without an external field. The interesting question for us is, I mean, you might say, well, okay, I know my Landau theory, why this guy is telling that again to me. But of course, the important point is this is a non-equilibrium system, right? And it's it's a small system. It's not so clear that this is working. And if you ask me why that is, my answer is, well, we don't know. We don't know why that is. But what I show you, I think this analogy here is much deeper than what I have presented to you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Here I can read a question now. I read a question by an attendee. So thank you for the nice talk. From a biologically realistic point of view, do you think that this collective behavior emerged by trial and error in evolution, which is what I think happens in reinforcement learning? Or is there some deeper self-organization mechanism at play that tunes the system close to a critical point?
Mm-hmm. I mean, okay, I'm not a biologist, so everything I'm saying here, in particular, this thing is on YouTube. I have to be super careful. I don't want to confront it with my whatever.
We can edit it.
Okay, you cut it out. Perfect. No, okay, you cut it out. Then I can be very speculative. Well, I mean, I of course would suggest. I mean, according to Darwin. Evolution is not, so to say, directed in one. The only direction is, I mean, the survival of the fittest is a trial and error solution, okay? That is what makes sense to me, and I think this is also probably agreed by most scientists. Now, you asked about this critical behavior. This is exactly what I wanted to indicate, and that's also why, and this is not proposed by us, but also by biologists, which assume that if you would be a collective group and you would optimize the behavior, of course, via trial and error, being maximally responsive to a predator, I mean, the choice to make the rule such that you are in a collective state, which is also close to a critical point, that's not the worst decision you can make, okay? And I mean, that's essentially the line of arguing. I agree, of course, it's very temptive, and the more temptive things are, this is a lesson I got from my supervisor at that time in Heidelberg. The more suggestive something is, the more careful you should be. I try to be as careful as I can be. All I was doing, I was listing you evidence, empirical evidence. But I have to say it's, I mean, I like the idea. And of course, animals, even though they do not know the purpose, why they are doing what they are doing, at the end, if they are doing something which is awfully wrong, well, they become extinct. And so I guess it's a fair approach to say it must be good for something. If you observe a collective state, there must be an underlying purpose. And I mean, that's essentially also a little bit direction of the reinforcement learning, right? To figure out a little bit what's the motivation of particles to do something.
So I guess, let me see if there are any other questions. So no, doesn't seem to be no more questions. No one has raised hands. So I will say at this point, thank you again, Clemens, for this beautiful and inspiring talk. And I thank all the attendees of this colloquium. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Okay. So I guess